All right, guys, we're back again with another hot topic in the MMA world. And today we have the UFC antitrust lawsuit has some new progression. I am Matthew Wells, my man, Patrick O'Shea on the other side. It's been covering this very closely. So, Pat, what's been going on with this? The latest things happening this week in terms of this lawsuit going on with the UFC and the antitrust case?
Yeah, so this is something, again, this suit started way back in 2014, to give you an idea of how long this has been going on, 6 years or so. After, several motions to dismiss were ruled out, and then they set evidentiary hearings about class certification, which, just a quick background on that, that's the difference between if all of the fighters suing individually or suing together, like a class action lawsuit. So this is basically been all hurtling towards whether or not the judge would say, hey, this is class certified, as in you can all sue together, which makes the damages substantially higher and really allows the lawsuit to go on, versus saying, no, we're not going to grant class certification. You each have to sue individually, which pretty much even the judge said would kill the lawsuit in its tracks. So everyone thought that this, I guess, I don't even know what to hear. I guess a hearing, technically, that was scheduled for September 17th was going to be the judge's decision on whether or not class certification was granted. He had said 3 months ago or so that a decision was forthcoming, had thrown out a couple of different motions and ruled on a couple of various motions regarding class certification beforehand, just in terms of testimony and things like that. And we get to this motion, or this, I guess, hearing is what you want to call it. And the judge just asks if anything's changed due to COVID-19. He asked both counsels, has anything changed because of the pandemic? Any material changes in the facts? Both counsels say no, that's not the case. And then he says that he hasn't finalized the ruling, but that he is likely to side with the plaintiffs, meaning it's likely he's going to grant class certification. He said that 4 times. So if we get a finalized order here and it's not in favor of these fighters, that would be mind-blowing, because he strongly hinted at we're going to get class certification granted and the trial, or at least the next phase will continue, which is most likely an appeal.
It's very interesting that COVID would be such a, I guess, not necessarily a deciding factor, but a focal point, like you just mentioned. What would be the main difference, I guess, that COVID would make versus everything leading up in the past few years that this has been going on?
I really don't know. It's one of those things where basically the groundwork of the class certification was down to expert testimony, which the UFC had expert Robert Topol saying that you should use wage levels, while Dr. Hal Singer for the plaintiff said that you should use wage shares, which wage shares is kind of out there. It's never been used in an antitrust case like this. So even Dr. Singer has admitted that. But you have these 2 experts with their testimonies and how they think class certification should be granted. And then you have the academia and the research behind that and how it applies to the UFC's business model. COVID hasn't really affected any of that. There's been no material changes whatsoever where COVID, you might think COVID would play a role in this. And, Dr. Paul Gift, John Nash, Jason Cruz have all been following this since its inception back in 2014, have been really doing a lot of work on uncovering some of the documents that have been released by the court and some of the financials behind that. All said that it didn't really make sense for the judge to have this hearing just to ask those questions and to say that he would likely side one way or the other without actually finalizing the order. So it's very strange all around. Not really sure what the thinking was of the judge here. Nobody really seems to know that I've talked to. I don't understand, because again, it's not going to change the research or the testimony he's already heard. So it's just a weird occurrence that kind of sets out feelers for whatever reason that he's going to rule a particular way.
It's very interesting, man. And this, like you said, this thing has been going on for years and years and years. And obviously this is something that the UFC wants to, come out head on, right? They don't want to, admit that, hey, we're at fault here. I'm so curious that we seem to be getting close to the plaintiffs, the fighters being on the winning side of this. what would a future in the UFC look like if the plaintiffs are granted what they're trying to get here?
Well, so there's a couple of things that go along with that question. First of all, this is just class certification, right? This isn't even going to trial yet. So this is basically, think of all this stuff as pre-trial. Like before you'd get in front of a jury, before you'd have all that stuff, this is all pre-trial to see if it even makes it there. If they're granted class certification, that's a big win for the plaintiffs, but the UFC is going to appeal. And then judges in the appellate court are going to review all that information. It's going to drag out, at least I would gather, the appellate process, because then depending on what the appellate court says, you could go one step further to the Supreme Court. So, I mean, you're looking at something along the lines of a year or two just to sort all this out. If you get to a point where class certification is granted, appeals are done, and it's going to move forward to trial, then you're looking at, does the UFC pursue a trial? Do they try and, make a deal and settle in case it goes to trial and some things are granted? In a perfect world for the plaintiffs, if it goes to trial and they win, not only do they get damages, but things like contract lengths could be shortened. So you might only be able to keep a fighter under contract for a year or two. There would be none of this, 4-fight, 5-fight contracts within this window where we have to offer you so many fights, or if you're a champion, you automatically get extended. That would go away. You'd start to see something more like boxing, where you've got, a couple. You'd also be allowed to, again, have fighters start their own promotions and say, hey, I want a belt, all this stuff. It could open the floodgates wide open for MMA really turning into boxing here. But if any of that would be granted as remedy, we don't know, because it's possible you could go through the trial. They could just get shut down and court could side with the UFC anyway. They could grant remedy in the form of, damages, which is money. But, how much money is always subject to the jury and the judge. And I'm sure there would be appeals on that as well. So it's going to be dragging out for a long, long time. And what the ramifications are still unknown. But if they got class certification and they kept moving forward, this would be a really big deal.
And for sure, it would be a huge deal. And like you said, with the boxing thing, that's one of the things that is, I think, one of the more primary concerns for a lot of more casual fans or fans that have been paying attention to this, because there are some advantages to going to that more boxing, quote unquote, model where you have a bunch of different promotions that have a bunch of top fighters. But the problem that comes with that is that it's always tough to get the big fights, guys that are in their prime to fight each other. There's always so many roadblocks when it comes to that. And that's really from the fans' perspective, that's what's great about the UFC. Right? They have everybody tied up in these contracts for, like you said, 3, 4, 5 fight deals. Can't go anywhere else. You're going to fight for us. And we have to offer you these, at least, 3 fights a year. Otherwise, we have to release you, or whatever the case may be. If they go that boxing route, that's going to create a lot of stress for the fans. And I know the focus here is on the fighters, and it very well should be. I think the easiest answer to this, for the most case, would be, hey, let's implement like a rev share where fighters are paid properly. That's obviously a whole nother different avenue. But that's one path to, I guess, resolving a lot of the complaints here from fighters. What would you think or how do you even see a potential plan like playing out to where the UFC is no longer having that stronghold on number one? Because we see the UFC, they're doing things in Vegas right now where they're literally trying to make a UFC city inside of Vegas, to where they're trying to be self-sustainable. These are the words that Dana White says. So they're doing things that no other promotion's doing. Obviously, they're the biggest one out there, excluding one with their billions and billions of fans worldwide. Do you see this having any sort of like major impact here, at least stateside, to where the UFC is no longer that stranglehold on the MMA market?
It's possible. A lot of things would have to fall into the right place for that to happen. If they get class certification and then they head to trial, the only way that I could ever see the UFC really losing big in all of this is if they go to trial and up until the verdict, they think they're going to win. If they think the whole time, like, yes, we're going to win, we're confident in this, and then they don't, that's where they lose their stranglehold. By most indications, they would probably have an idea. The lawyers would have an idea like, hey, here are the risks, based on the testimony that we did here, based on what the judge seems to be ruling throughout the case, we can kind of lean one way or another to see how the trial would actually go. And if they start to feel uneasy about it, they're going to settle. Because like you said, if it goes to a boxing model, the biggest losers are by far the UFC. Like, fighters would get the most out of it for sure. They'd get paid more. They'd get, more than their fair share of revenue, would be able to negotiate on their behalf in such a way that they would be, especially the superstars would be making way more money than they're making now. But I can't imagine the UFC would ever let it get to that level. It would have to be them being completely dead wrong about where the trial was going. Other than that, if they didn't even want to go through trial or deal with the headache of this or take any risk there, it's very possible they end up with some type of rev share, as you mentioned, because I feel that most of the fighters are okay continuing to fight in the UFC with some of those contract restrictions as long as they got paid enough. I feel like that's a fair amount of the fighters, especially the bigger name fighters, where they're totally fine with that. They just want some more money. I can't imagine, Dustin Poirier, getting the money he wants and then say, you know what, now I'm going to go fight other guys. Because that's just not how a lot of those top guys are. They want to fight the best. They want to be named the best. So I don't imagine, I think the likelihood of it getting to the point where the UFC loses all its power, I think that's pretty low just because there's probably some settlement between now and then. I also think that, again, unless the fighters banded together in some way to really push the trial to go forward and to say, no, we're doing this no matter what, I don't see a resolution where the fighters are going to get the best world of that boxing revenue. So we'll see what happens. Again, this is years and years off from being resolved. But my best guess right now is class certification will be granted. It'll go to the appeals court. The appeals court may or may not overturn it just because some of Dr. Singer's methodology is kind of out there and has even admitted it's kind of out on a limb. So we'll see what the appellate court feels about that. But even if it gets class certification, you're probably looking at some type of revenue share settlement from the UFC before they risk going to trial unless they're sure they can win.
It's crazy, man. Especially when we have guys like you mentioned, Dustin Poirier. There were reports coming out of Tony Ferguson going to bat for him, obviously on social media, but also behind doors. Apparently, Tony Ferguson went to bat for Dustin Poirier, saying, "Hey, pay the man his money." Like, these are things that wouldn't necessarily happen if we were talking about that sort of boxing model, because those two could figure it out. If they were more so representing themselves or had separate promotions, like if, for example, like if one were a PBC and one were a Golden Boy fighter, those guys could negotiate and come together and come to agreement as long as, their respective promotions agreed. But here we have one entity controlling everything. And if they don't want to pay, they're not going to pay right now. And unfortunately, the fans lose out. The fighters lose out because they don't get their payday. We don't get the fights that we want to see as fans. And, at the end of the day, the UFC still wins. They're like, okay, guess what? We're still putting on a show. We're still getting paid from the networks that we have contracts with. So doesn't matter to us unless it's a pay-per-view to put on the big fights. So that's where we are right now. And unfortunately, like you said, it's going to be years and years and years before any of this gets shaken out and we get any sort of resolution. I just hope for the fighter's sake and the fan's sake that we come out ahead at the end of the day. Yeah, no, I mean, I think if we can get some, compromise where the UFC's model of having a lot of the best fighters gets to stay intact, or at least in some sense that you could do cross promotion between, Bellator and UFC or something where, everybody gets a win-win, so to speak. That would be awesome. Is that going to happen? I really don't know. It's far too early to tell, unfortunately. And another big wrench that could be thrown into all of this, as we mentioned, it's going to take years for this to shake out. If the fighters do somehow come to some sort of formation of a union in between now and then, that could, flip a bunch of things on its head, because who knows what things look like after that. So I also have no idea if that's going to happen. Probably not anytime soon. But given that it's been 6 years already,
and it could likely be another 6 years before this is all resolved. Who knows what could go down in between then. So hopefully everybody gets a middle ground where the fans are happy, fighters are happier, and the UFC is okay being a little less happy, because right now they're kind of sitting in the best position possible. So
yeah, no doubt. And like you said, the fighter union thing is huge. And to go back to one of your earlier points with this particular lawsuit, as you said, if fighters were to go individually, there would be no lawsuit right now. So you're stronger together than you are apart, fighters. So if you guys want to unionize, you're stronger together than you are apart. So just keep that in mind every single day. Every time it's time to renegotiate your contracts, every time you get screwed over on a deal, just keep that in mind.
Yeah, it's, and again, right now there's a whole nother issue with whether or not the union would be certified by the NLRB given the current administration. But, if things change in November and then you get a new administration in there that's much more union friendly, that's a very astute point, Mr. Wells.